I have the great pleasure of speaking to Dr. Clare Kelly today. Clare is a cognitive neuroscientist and an associate professor of psychology of Trinity College Dublin in Ireland. Clare also serves as the director of undergraduate teaching and learning in the School of Psychology. Over the past years, Clare has been making a push towards bringing climate science into the undergrad curriculum, and she has designed a course specifically on the psychology of the climate crisis herself. Clare, it's very nice to have you here today. You're a cognitive neuroscientist. How did you get into working on the psychology of the climate crisis specifically?
Thanks, Natalie. I'm really delighted to be part of Climate Match. I think it's important to start off by saying that I'm not a lifelong climate activist. I've always, I suppose, cared about environmental issues, but I was getting on with the things that we all do as academics. Did my PhD, took up a postdoc in the US. Was going to conferences, building my career. Eventually, got a job and started a family. And as a neuroscientist, I probably thought, that this was about right. I was watching my kind of individual carbon footprint, and with the kind of belief that other people, the climate scientists, the politicians, the advocates, and activists were kind of on top of things and taking care that we knew there was a crisis and people were doing stuff about it. And what could I possibly do anyway, as a cognitive neuroscientist? But over time, and particularly more recently, it's kind of had this growing worry, a feeling brewing that there was a major disconnect between what I was doing on a daily basis, and what I could see needed to be done, and a kind of a collective failure to really make inroads on the crisis, to act as if we're in an emergency, and to really respond to what's going on. And so I was dealing with this feeling of dissonance when a paper came along that kind of opened up some possibilities for me. So it was in late 2019, Adam Aron, who is a very famous cognitive neuroscientist, he published a paper in Trends in Cognitive Scientists calling on cognitive scientists to take action on the climate crisis. And he described he described the urgency of the situation and why cognitive neuroscientists needed to do their part. And then he talked about different things that we could do. So things like, advocating for action within your university, educating yourself, joining action groups, but also research and teaching. And this just resonated with me, connected with me. And I was lucky enough to be able to kind of draw on colleagues in the university with more direct research expertise in the climate crisis to pull together my module on the psychology of the climate crisis, which I've been teaching for three years now.
So, can you describe to us in a few sentences what exactly the psychology of the climate crisis is?
Sure. So the climate crisis is clearly the result of human behavior. And so, as the science of human behavior, psychology is really central to our understanding of why we're here, what it is about human thought and behavior, and the structures and systems that we have created, what it is about these that have led to the current crisis, why we're stuck, why we are not responding as if we're in an emergency, and then what can we do about it? So how can we leverage our understanding of human thought and behavior to really motivate and foster action at all levels of society? And so when people hear about psychology of the climate crisis, they often think that, what the focus is on climate emotions and climate anxiety and so on. And, that's a part of what we talk about because that's an impact of the climate crisis, but it's actually a relatively small part, because what we're really focused on is I suppose, understanding what's gone wrong, why we're not responding sufficiently, and what we can do about it.
So, about this last part, are there a few simple psychological concepts that would explain why, as a whole human community, we're aware of climate change, we make promises and commitments, and in the end, still we mainly remain inactive?
One, or often the focus of psychological and behavioral explanations for the climate crisis ends up being on these on the quirky or flawed ways in which human cognition works. So people might be familiar with the work of Daniel Kahneman and colleagues. He's a Nobel Prize winner for his work that people might have come across in his popular book, Thinking Fast and Slow. So he and his colleagues described flaws in our thinking, or mental shortcuts. These are known as cognitive heuristics and biases in the way that we think. And they're often quite, these are often quite attractive as explanations for the climate crisis. So these are things like our tendency to prioritize immediate rewards and satisfaction over future rewards or long-term gains, our difficulty making sacrifices now for gains in the future, our tendency to be overly optimistic, something called psychological distance, which means that the kind of perceived imminence of a threat is reduced, and the impact of the threat is reduced when it is kind of removed, both in physically, so where it is in space, temporally in time, socially in terms of who it affects, and kind of experientially, so whether we have to imagine it or experience it directly. And so the climate crisis is matches all of those criteria in that it tends to be removed in space and time and social. It's happening to people far away, and we have to imagine the impacts. So that makes it less threatening to us. Humans are not particularly good with probabilities. We're very sensitive to priming, and framing affects the way that information is presented. And we're exquisitely sensitive to social context. So we care a lot about, or we look to other people to decide what to do. And these are all, these are all part of human cognition. And they're often seen as the explanation for why we're failing to act on the climate and biodiversity crisis. And recently, there's been a realization that this narrative is very problematic, because it promotes a reading of the psychological evidence that essentially justifies the crisis. It sees the climate and biodiversity crisis as a product of universal human nature, something that is inevitable. There's an increasing recognition that while there are these quirks in human psychology, they don't explain the whole story. The bigger issue that we need to address are the economic, social, political systems and ideologies that we have created that have created the crisis and sustain it. There are things we can do, and there are lessons from psychology. So I think one of the most important frameworks for understanding both inaction and action is the idea of social norms. And so I already referred to is that humans are really sensitive to what other people think and what other people are doing. And we look to other people to decide how to behave. And so, for example, there was a study in the US last year that showed 80 to 90% of Americans drastically underestimate concern and support for climate action. And what this does is create what's called a false social reality, in which we think others don't care, and we are reluctant to speak up and to talk about our concerns and our support for action. And then this negatively impacts our belief that action will be successful. So I think one of the most important things that we can do as climate scientists, but also as citizens, is just to speak up about our concerns and our support for action. And this will help to bring about the collective pressure on our governments, on our politicians.
That's quite a task. You're talking about systematic changes, and the system that you personally have been working on is the academic system. So How do you think that academics and the academic system at the moment are going wrong, and what do we need to improve to address the current climate crisis within that system?
Yeah, so I don't think academics and the academic system are currently doing enough, and I think it's partly because we're stuck back at this. It's not my place to do things, or I'm not a climate scientist, and of course the climate scientists out there are doing amazing work, and they have been shouting from the rooftops for years. But we need to stand up and support them. One of the things that we have to remember is that as academics and scientists, we're in such a privileged position in society, particularly those of us that teach, because, that's where we have this opportunity to influence the next generation, which can then ripple out into society. And so one of the things that we do in our paper is we highlight work, really excellent papers by other scientists and academics that are highlighting the need for us to become and to see ourselves as activists and advocates. And I think, this can be a real challenge for academics because we're very reluctant to be seen as activists or advocates. And, coming from a good place like this, and this desire to be seen as objective or apolitical. But it's really important that we recognize that academia doesn't exist in a vacuum, and refusing to take a position on something actually just upholds the status quo. So I really encourage people to explore avenues for advocacy and activism.
So, speaking about speaking up, speaking out, and writing opinion pieces, um, is there a way in which climate scientists or scientists in general can improve the way they communicate about the climate crisis?
Yeah, so when it comes to science communication specifically, there's quite a bit of work on challenges to public understanding of the science behind the climate crisis, and there are some lessons that from psychology. So, for example, Adam Aron has a great textbook in which he describes some of these in a chapter. So some of this is to do with the way that we teach the mechanisms behind global heating. That actually a lot of people, while they might understand that human activity causes CO2 emissions, they don't really understand the basic mechanisms underlying the greenhouse effect. They don't understand the idea of carbon sources and sinks. And so there are ways that we can improve our science communication to improve knowledge and understanding. But we also know that, an information deficit is not necessarily the problem that's driving inaction. And so there are some lessons from psychology that can help us to understand, what's going on. So we know we need to do things like emphasize the consensus among climate scientists. I referred to disinformation and denial that has been funded by the fossil fuel companies, and there's loads of scientific research documenting this. We can also do things like leverage better visual communications, all the things that we learn as students and as academics about how to communicate our data visually. But we can also be aware of things like the role of social identity and motivated reasoning. So social identity is another really important psychological framework that describes how the social groups that we see ourselves as belonging to actually give us part of our identity and self-worth, that they're what we draw a lot of our self-concept and self-esteem from. And as a result, we'll engage in what's called identity protective cognition. It's a form of motivated reasoning, a tendency to seek out information that's congruent with your pre-existing values and beliefs, and to process information in a way that's congruent with those, and then to avoid information that conflicts with your identity and the values and beliefs that stem from it. And so if you see yourself as politically conservative, then your attitudes and beliefs are going to be consistent with that, and you're going to be motivated to protect them. And you may be motivated as a result to disregard or question or deny scientific information about the climate crisis.
That's really good advice. I feel we went through a lot of this in bits and pieces here and there already, but what would you advise our students as members of the general public, but also as climate scientists, to do from here on out to do their best to protect the planet and work on the climate crisis?
Vocalize our concern, our support for action. To do that, finding your community is enormously important. So solidarity with other people is really sustaining. Doing this stuff on your own can be really, really difficult. There's a paper by Anna Arai and Charlotte Ray is the first author, where they lay out a whole list, they have a beautiful infographic on the different actions that academics and scientists can take. Things like flying less, things like greening your lab and watching your computational resources, pushing your university for action, as I already said, voting, being politically active in your life. Again, not necessarily gluing yourself to anything, but just taking all of those actions that together lead to this public pressure for change.
Thank you so much, Claire. I feel I learned a lot over the last 20 minutes. Thank you so much for being with us. I think our students, as well as us as organizers, appreciate your time, your insights, and we're hoping to be that community together. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, and delighted to be part of Climate Match. And yeah, it's exactly the kind of way to find your community and build some solidarity for action. So well done to everybody.